Who doesn't love whipping up Super Bowl recipes? It's one of those rare moments we all unite as a nation to celebrate with fun and amazing food. If football and feasting is your ultimate Sunday plan, stick around. Tangy cheese fondues had their spotlight in the sun during the middle of the 20th century. We're talking about the very early years of the Super Bowl, which was actually first played in 1967, if you never knew. This was a Swiss dish, and it's been around since the very first bowl, so that gives it at least some kind of veteran status. It was introduced to a lot of football crowds by the Swiss Cheese Union, who really didn't spare any dollars when they started marketing this. It was introduced in the middle of the 1960s, but by the 1970s alone, it became a must-have for every American family. It's like having a fondue set was some unspoken social rule you had to follow. Plus, it wasn't just the football games themselves. The Super Bowl parties people would throw at homes would always involve cheese fondues. A part of it was that it was such an interactive snack and it worked so well as a party thing that people didn't know what topped it. Spam and pineapple skewers were also a massive hit at these Super Bowl parties, and a big part of that was how people would dip them in the cheese fondues. You can kind of get an image of the vibe around these parties, and the Super Bowl, it's really just an episode of Scooby-Doo. These were also called Hawaiian kebabs, and they're pretty heavily involved in tiki food culture, which was, as fate would have it, the thing that was on everyone's minds between the 50s and the 60s. The skewers were something that did so good at concession stands and living room parties, and Hawaii was a united state where all this craze peaked. People loved Polynesian-style food, and that's what led to tiki culture being popular elsewhere. Plus, these skewers were so easy to make. Places that already were known for how much Spam they ate, like Minnesota or Austin, would especially abuse these skewers. It was almost like when you get your cat hooked on a specific kind of canned tuna. So let's talk about some regional favorites. While you wouldn't find shrimp wiggles at any other state besides New England, if you ever went to a Super Bowl party in the state, it was pretty much the standard. This was doubly true for Maine, and a big part of that is the way canned seafood was essentially the bread and butter for so many people. Southern hosts would make dips that were centered around shrimp wiggles and would serve it with a Nick sauce and really make an appetizer out of it. This was something that you would mostly only find in New England and not outside of it because the age of shrimp wiggles passed. It was something that people came up with in the Depression as a way of making use of canned shrimp or fresh shrimp that they were catching, but it's still something that a specific niche of seafood fans carried on over into the later decades. Once you find a dip, you kind of tend to never let go of it, because, let's be honest, how often do you find a dip that you know is just perfect for you? Now, Jello salads with mini hot dogs, on the other hand, were arguably peak Super Bowl food. Experimental dishes like this were in fashion, and they were largely the vibe everyone was going for with their time in the kitchen. People wanted to try out new things because they were too bored of the same old dishes that had been circulating since the time of their grandmothers, and nothing said new like shiny gelatin and hot dogs. Well, hot dogs are a familiar face, but you've never had them with Jello, have you? You can say that about a lot of experimental food in America. A lot of it is something that's dramatically new and something that's too familiar. Anyway, while these salads made a name for themselves in church potlucks, bridge club gatherings, and a lot more, they were super popular at Super Bowl parties in the 60s. They started fading away towards the 70s because of how they stayed a niche dish, though. The trend of trying new quirky fusion food was popular, but not every food that came out of it managed to have a long life expectancy. And while this dish did crazy numbers at the start, it couldn't carry that momentum through to the later decades. Deviled ham dip was a Super Bowl favorite, and it has a very successful track record from the 60s to the early 1980s. It was a savory dip that was just the right kind of rich and creamy with a bit of a spicy afterkick. The secret ingredient responsible for its rise to culinary stardom was canned deviled ham, and one of the most popular brands people would use for theirs was Underwood. You had cream cheese, sour cream, or other kinds of seasonings, and it was the perfect thing for a Super Bowl because not only did it have an amazingly bold flavor, but it was also really affordable and easy to make. You could mix it with basic ingredients you've been having in your pantry for weeks and pair it with Super Bowl favorites like Triscuits and potato chips or even wings. Hosts loved meals like this because they would cut the work and essentially ensure that you spend less time in the kitchen and more time discussing your favorite teams and players, getting in the mood for Super Bowl Sunday, and just unwinding with your friends and family. Cheese balls with pimentos were one of the biggest party foods of the 50s. That was a fact that was pretty undisputed all the way up to the 80s, where you could begin to say that their popularity was starting to wane a little. The pimento cheese influence was real. It was a quick and easy way of adding a southern twist to cheese balls, something that had already made a lot of inroads for itself as one of the nicest holiday snacks or a perfect meal for cocktail hour. It was only natural for people to put two and two together and realize this has all the makings of a football fan favorite meal. Pimento cheese did really well in Georgia and the Carolinas, and when it eventually made its way into the Midwest where cheese balls were a massive hit, people started to make pimento cheese balls in bulk. The combination of cream cheese, Worcestershire sauce, pimentos, and cheddar cheese was so full of vibrant flavor, and the texture was just perfect. The kind of thing that never really felt like a hassle to eat, only an enjoyment. Pimento cheese balls were mostly something that were old-fashioned by the 90s, though, and that's more or less why they wouldn't be seen too much at Super Bowl parties going forward into the 21st century. What did do well in the 80s, 90s, and eventually the 21st century was a recipe people considered a knockout. The stuffed jalapeno meatball format served many families very well throughout several Super Bowls, and that didn't change in the modern era. There's still a popular snack you'd see at parties, but maybe just not every Super Bowl. In the 80s and 90s, though, while things like pimento cheese balls were taking a bit of a backseat as compared to everything else, jalapeno poppers were something that were gaining popularity and people had started to mix them into meatballs. In the 1990s and the 2000s, bacon-wrapped appetizers had become something that were really just the ideal party food, and when people saw how good that was working out, their mind immediately went to what would happen if you stuffed it with bacon instead. From there on, adopting the Southern trend of stuffed jalapenos into their Super Bowl routine. Spicy food started to become a real thing, you know? Adrenaline runs high, you have all sorts of passionate fans locked in. It makes sense why that would put you in the mood for something hot. Now, you might be noticing that a lot of these dishes are small, easy-to-handle party foods that if, gun to your head, somebody asked you to describe them, you'd probably say they were more like snacks than full-on meals. Touchdown tamale pies, on the other hand, were a casserole-style dish that had the flavors of all the things we've talked about so far, the cheesiness, the spiciness, and the savoriness, but it took a while for this to become nationally recognized as a Super Bowl meal. I mean, the potential was always there, it just needed a bit of a spark. The reasons for it having that potential are pretty transparent. Casserole-style dishes have always been easy for hosts to make ahead of time, and that's why throughout the 20th and even the 21st century, they've been a go-to party food for a lot of people. You'd see tamale pies in Arizona, New Mexico, California, and even Midwest states like Ohio and Illinois. In those places, casseroles were already beloved by Midwesterners, and tamale pies were an accessible gateway into more Tex-Mex cuisine. Reuben dip was something that was inherently tied with the Reuben sandwich, but while the sandwich didn't make sense as a Super Bowl meal, the dip made astounding progress and overtook a lot of other famous dips, really. Besides, who honestly sits down for a 60-minute-long game with a sandwich that would end in 5 minutes? And most people don't really even watch it that way. The Super Bowl, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, can take up to or even over 4 hours, so it's really wise to prepare your food as if you'll be running a marathon and not a sprint. No matter where you were enjoying the Super Bowl, whether that was New York, New Jersey, Florida, the snowbird regions, Minnesota and Pennsylvania, or even outskirts on the edges of town, you would always find people excitedly preparing Reuben dip as they would count down the hours and seconds left until the bowl started. It was a cheesy, hot dip that was perfect for a winter football game, and while Reuben sandwiches went out of style in the 80s and 70s, people loved this retro Reuben dip because of its nostalgic appeal and obvious convenience. Cocktail weenies and grape jelly sauce probably have the biggest lifespan on this list so far. You'd still find people throwing Super Bowl watch parties making these, And they'd all have their own trusted, tried, and tested variations and toppings to go with it too. With just a few ingredients, they were one of the most high-reward party foods you could make. I mean, the bang for your buck was insane. Plus, most hosts were relying on crockpots towards the end of the 20th century so that the weenies would stay warm, and the weenies themselves just tasted amazing. The perfect mix of sweet, succulent grape jelly combined with the chilliness of the sauce and its tanginess was an addictive mix. It was also perfect finger food. You didn't need a plate or a fork. All you needed was some toothpicks to poke into the weenies with and a lot of tissues, but hey, who has ever had a clean Super Bowl? Tempers flare, volumes rise, and well, people never go easy on their drinks. That's also why people would love these weenies, because they'd go so well with your beer. The smokiness and sweetness of these meant that Super Bowl classics like Budweiser were something you could have with your food and enjoy it too. Now, before I get into whether or not this was a Super Bowl favorite, let's talk about what a French bread pizza loaf even is. So you take a split loaf of French bread, right? Nobody hates that. You top it with some pizza sauce, your favorite pizza toppings like olives, mushrooms, sausages, onions, green chilies, whatever makes your day, and you wrap it up with some mozzarella. Throw that in the oven until you get it baked nice and crispy, and you get a super quick and easy DIY homemade alternative to frozen pizza or frozen foods. It was something that became a Super Bowl favorite in the middle of the 70s, which was a decade full of highly prolific food like this. The kind of recipes that really knew how to make their way into the middle of trends and catch everyone's eyes and hearts. They were also perfect for sharing, because you could split the French bread loaf in any way, really. You could slice it into squares or strips, and then you could also do it half and half. Half the bread could be topped with mozzarella and, let's say, vegetarian toppings, while the other half could be eaten by meat lovers. Chili cheese logs were kind of the same. This was basically a trifecta of different kinds of cheeses mixed and made into a spreadable cheese log, and man, was this thing dense. It would have like a smorgasbord of different kinds of things packed into it. Chopped nuts, crushed tortilla chips, Ritz crackers, bits of sausages and ham, olives and vegetables. It was the kind of dish that you could change and adjust according to your own preferences and tastes, so I managed to have some kind of regional popularity in almost every corner of America. Places like Arizona and New Mexico had their own savory and extra spicy takes on it, whereas places like the South couldn't get enough of their pepper jack and smoked cheddar. Other areas like Minnesota and Indiana, popular Midwest places, would use it to add to their revolving door of different cheese-based foods perfect for Super Bowls. The long story short being, this was the perfect kind of thing for parties, and everyone that had it knew that tuna and noodle casserole bites were supposed to be a mini downsized version of the iconic tuna noodle casserole. Usually people would throw these in some tight muffin tins and form them into bite-sized portions because the goal was to again just have a lot of munchies. The tuna noodle casserole, as good as it is, was an incredibly heavy dish and not exactly the best fit for Super Bowl Sunday. This Midwestern comfort staple was one of the best ideas that ever came out of the middle of the 20th century though, and it was also a masterclass in adapting to the times. Tuna and noodle casseroles were amazing, but the decade of casseroles was the 60s and towards the end of the 20th century. That's just now what people preferred anymore. Adapting it into finger food, on the other hand, was amazing, and it meant that people could pretty much just use the same blueprint for other cult classics. Still, you can't take their roots away from them. What I said about tuna noodle casseroles not being the best fit for Super Bowl Sunday was true, because even though these were a lot more accessible, they weren't exciting enough to last as a Super Bowl party food. 7-layer Jello salad was something that was a creamy, multi-layered gelatin dessert that was one of the best things to bring out at a Super Bowl party. Sometimes a dish is actually carried by how good it looks, but if it actually ends up tasting good on top of that, then you have yourself some serious competition. And during Super Bowl season, it's a lot harder to compete. I mean, in states where Jello was already a fan favorite, like Missouri, this was just a really welcome addition. You're giving them their favorite thing, then telling them there are like 7 colorful layers of it? You know where that's going. Jello dishes were also really popular in many Mormon communities and Utah. Jello dishes were one of the most popular meals to have in those communities, and they'd often throw on toppings like shredded carrots, whipped cream toppings, and marshmallows, which was a little weird for Super Bowl, but hey, everyone has their own way of enjoying it. What people would do is that they would layer the Jello up in the colors of their favorite teams. Like you had red and gold for the 49ers, and then you had green and yellow for the Packers, and so on. Interactive meals did the best at Super Bowl parties because it really put you into that team spirit, as you can see. Beer cheese soup is a thick and velvety soup that people made with a lot of sharp cheddar cheese, which was supposed to be the main attraction of the dish. Then, you would throw in a large jug of Pilsner or ale, which was usually put in there for some extra flavor depth, and then the cream and butter would give it a thicker, nicer texture. Then you'd throw in some bacon, cayenne pepper and hot sauce, onions, garlic and mustard, and you were pretty much done. This was a lot different from your traditional game day dips. Beer cheese soup was something that was meant to be drunk and served in bread bowls, so it was not exactly the most popular one out of everything else on here. Still, it was definitely something that got a lot of traction at Super Bowl parties because beer and football are two things that go hand in hand. It didn't get as popular as, let's say, Reuben dips or something, but it definitely did make a mark that a lot of people might still remember from back in the day of the 80s and 90s. Speaking of dips, people decided to try out a new but familiar dip at Super Bowl parties when they took a page out of their potluck menu with Cool Whip and marshmallow fruit dips. This was something that even lasted well through the early 2000s. I won't oversell this one. It wasn't placing #1 on anyone's dip rankings, but it was something that was very popular with people who preferred dips to pork roasts during Super Bowl season. Retro, no-bake party foods were a thing that a lot of people wanted at their Super Bowl parties, but the light fluffiness of the marshmallow fruit dip is what kept it in a lot of people's lists. The Cool Whip gave it this really airy and creamy texture, whereas the marshmallows, which would sometimes be melted, would add a lot of sweetness and stickiness. The orange juice concentrate was something that would give a really fruity punch to the dip, and if you added in some cream cheese and paired it with the right kinds of fruit, you were looking at a pretty nice meal. You could dunk this with cookies, spread it on cakes, or dip fruits into it, or even dip biscuits and wafers. People ate all sorts of things during the Super Bowl, and if nothing else, at least this would do super well during halftime. Pizza roll-ups were one of the nicest dishes to make during Super Bowls. Pizza roll-ups were the kind of thing that you would always love to have because they were like this snacky version of your favorite meal. I mean, really, pizzas themselves were always a Super Bowl classic, but turning them into these bite-sized roll-ups just made them spread like wildfire amongst the party scene in America. The issue with pizzas was that around Super Bowl season, there would always be massive influxes of orders at your local joints and even big franchise names like Papa John's and Domino's. Then, most people would be traveling decent distances to visit their family or friends and watch with them. And pizza delivery wasn't a thing in every area either. They just weren't the most portable thing to get. Despite that, people still wanted to enjoy the flavor of pizzas during their favorite football game, and that's how pizza roll-ups became a thing. They were one of the most flavorful meals you could have during the show, and people would typically use crescent roll dough or tortilla wraps for this. That was pretty much the star of the show. The next thing you had to do was just adjust the toppings until they matched whatever you wanted, and boom, you had officially made your own personal pizza roll-up. People had recipes they relied on and would swear by, and they really wouldn't let them go. It became a point of pride for a lot of people where transportable and easy comfort food like this was a regional favorite. Microwave nacho casseroles were one of the best things to come out of modern technology, convenience food, and rabid culinary experimentation. This was a cheesy nacho dish that was layered and was very quick to make, but the catch here is this: the entire thing could be made inside the microwave. I know you've heard of microwavable chocolate cakes and mug cakes. Well, this is pretty much the savory equivalent of that. Get a plastic Tupperware bowl and you were pretty much ready to start. These were also different from your typical nacho affair. Unlike the crispy loaded nachos you may be used to getting at restaurants, you would get a cheesy, gooey version of them that was in practice a lot closer to a dip than it was a casserole. The most common things that people would use in these would be tortilla chips and taco meat, typically with McCormick taco seasoning, or they'd throw in some of Hornell's canned chili. The salsa and cheese would pretty much make or break the dish though. You could throw in paste picante, Tostitos salsa, or keep it simple with different kinds of cheese layers. The best ones to go for were the shredded Mexican cheese blends, which would always kind of melt unevenly, so it would be a toss-up between who got the luckiest spot at the table. If that wasn't available, people would use layers of Velveeta and Kraft Singles cheese, and as for toppings, jalapenos were a must-have, but everything else was up to preference. It was a pretty spectacular dish, really. All things considered, it was a great take on making casseroles into something more fit for parties. On the other hand, buffalo chicken rings were like these cheesy, spicy buffalo wings that were completely bite-sized. The appeal here was that since they were shaped into these perfectly munchable donut-like circles, not only were they perfect for parties because that was just way easier than eating them in their normal shape, they also became great for dips. These wings were completely wrapped in bread, which made them a lot less messy too. I don't know how Super Bowls work over at your place, but at mine, I need a team in hazmat suits to come clean up the sheer atrocities people leave behind during a tense match. These buffalo chicken rings helped by being a quarter as messy as their traditional saucy counterpart, but they were also a bit more heavier on the stomach than their usual non-deep-fried version. Since they took in so much oil and were really heavy, they didn't last too long as a Super Bowl favorite, mostly because you had to get like 30 or 40 wings to accommodate everyone. Some people have work after the Super Bowl too, you know? These rings got popular enough that you actually saw frozen, pre-made versions of them being sold in grocery stores. All you had to do with them was bake them or air fry them, which is probably what made them really spike in popularity. Tyson Anitizer's buffalo chicken rings were some of the best comfort food you could get in the early 2000s, and if the whole ring thing wasn't up your alley but you still wanted the flavor of these, you could go for TGI Fridays, which were doing their own buffalo chicken bites. If you remember any of these, share your Super Bowl memories in the comments with us. You hear the word Doritos casserole and you start thinking that maybe, just maybe, the internet has gone too far. You take a bite of it and you start to realize maybe the internet hasn't gone far enough. These crunchy, cheesy, and beefy casseroles were made with layers and layers of Doritos, specifically the nacho cheese ones. People threw in some seasoned taco meat with that and added a very decadent cream cheese filling, which was typically Tostitos nacho cheese dip that had been melted into the mixture very thoroughly. As far as ground beef went, nothing would beat Lori's Taco Spices, which was pretty much the nationally agreed spice blend for casseroles like this in the late 70s and 80s. Funnily enough, people would also add in some cream of mushroom soup, usually Campbell's, for some added texture. People claimed it helped sift through all the gooey, sticky cheese, which I can sort of imagine. As far as the taste went, you had a very salty and savory flavor from the cheese, but the crunch of the Doritos was definitely there. It stayed crispy throughout, and it was backed up by the way the beefy, cheesy sauce was right at the bottom. People would pretty much scoop it up and get to work the same way they would on a lasagna, and it was a natural sidekick to a lot of cheap beers like Miller Lights. It was more of a family dish, though, not the kind of thing that college students gathered in their dorms watching the bowl would have. Another thing that made a name for itself as some of the best things you could have with cheap beer were loaded potato skins with canned cheese. These were a staple of roadside bars, really, but the canned cheese they were using was what really made Themes stand out as something with an incredible amount of Super Bowl potential. The crispy potato skins would always be hollowed out, then baked and fried before people would finally top it off with bits of savory bacon, some sour cream, jarred nacho cheese, and black olives. You just needed a few russet potatoes for these and you were pretty much good to go, really. You know, though, as far as canned cheeses went, there was arguably no one brand that was better than Kraft Cheese Whiz, which had a really thick and ultra-smooth flavor. A lot of people thought it was actually seriously good at imitating the flavor of actual cheddar, and the potato skins themselves were just perfect no matter what kind of cheese you used. They were crispy on the outside and soft and fluffy on the inside, and the canned cheese just helped to tie everything into a neat little bow. The bits of meat and protein in there really added some smokiness and savoriness that the dish was missing overall, and the sour cream, especially Daisy or Breakstones, was one of the best pairings for these. All in all, it was the perfect snack to watch during a heated football game. Taco pizza was a fusion dish that did a lot of good for a lot of people. It was also just as divisive as it was beloved, but it ticked at least 5 out of 10 people's boxes, so. During the Super Bowl, people don't just get insanely passionate about the game and sport itself, they get super involved with the food, too. Everyone wants to be eating their favorite comfort foods, their favorite meals, and the things that just always put them in the best mood. Taco pizza was a mix of Midwestern pizza and Tex-Mex tacos, and put together they made for a very crispy and crunchy affair. The taco-seasoned ground beef also just made the perfect sidekick to this thing. I mean, the combination of all the toppings here was unbelievable. You had all the flavor of a taco, in the form of a pizza. Homemade versions were how this started out, but it became popular not because of word of mouth through moms about how this new pizza really keeps the kid quiet and seated, but thanks to Happy Joe's. No, really. Their pizza and ice cream parlor in Iowa staked a claim to the dish when they said they were the ones who invented it in the early 70s, and true or not, that drew a lot of eyes to the thing. From there on, it spread into other chains as they did their own pre-made frozen taco pizzas. If you really want to talk about something that's divisive, though, let's go over mayonnaise chocolate cake. Yeah, you really did just hear me say mayonnaise chocolate cake, 2 words even I never thought I'd read. I mean, look, over the course of my time here, I've gone over a lot of foods from a lot of different periods, and I'd like to say I'm familiar with the kind of out-of-the-box creativity our people are in the kitchen, but man, this thing was something else. The public reaction was like an extreme version of how people were reacting to pineapple pizza. It was something that first came thanks to the Great Depression. It was a really cost-saving recipe, but it was something people gladly left behind in the Depression because nobody liked eating it back then. They just thought it was really cheap, and that was a lot more preferable to memorable. In the 50s and 60s, there were these advertising campaigns by Hellman, and they were all centered around this cake, and by the 70s and 80s, it actually became a popular cake in some circles. There were now fans of mayonnaise chocolate cake, as unbelievable as that sounds. It was even something made for birthdays, which is almost as offensive as making it for the Super Bowl, if you ask me. Hellmann's might have told all of us that this makes your cake, but I think I like my cake just as it is, 100% all-natural cocoa. How about you? Would you ever give this a shot, especially during the Super Bowl? A while ago, I mentioned college students huddled together in their dooms watching the bowl, but do you ever wonder what they got up to in those hostels? Well, apparently, Mountain Dew gelatin squares were the youth's idea of a good time during the Super Bowl. This super colorful, super citrusy invention was something that was a true 90s party trick and something you would only see in the 20th century. It was made when you mixed Mountain Dew together with Jello, a bit of sugar and sometimes even caffeine or a lot of vodka for a boozy twist. You would get a hell of a drink out of this. And besides the usual frat and graduation parties or the weekly rave at these universities and colleges, most students would reserve these for Super Bowl season. Mountain Dew-based versions were things that were already getting really popular at college parties around the nation anyway, so from there on, it was only a short step away before they made a name for themselves as a Super Bowl party favorite. While people did use mostly the regular Mountain Dew, Code Red and Voltage flavors were also introduced. Personally, I think a pizza or some wings are fine for me, but hey, whatever helps you get more immersed in the match, right? Speaking of Southern traditions, this next one was a staple too. Yeah, let's turn our attention to pork jowl, an often overlooked cut of meat that's been a staple in Southern barbecue for years. The pork jowl was basically the cheek of the pig, and while it might not sound glamorous, it was packed with flavor and had a unique texture that barbecue lovers appreciated. It's fattier than bacon, but with a more intense flavor. Smoked or barbecued pork jowl was typically seasoned with a blend of spices and then cooked slowly to develop its rich, smoky flavor. Pork jowl might not be the most mainstream barbecue item these days, but it's a delicious example of how barbecue traditions make the most of every part of the pig. So, squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Gram's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Graham could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! In America, so many communities live together that often one will borrow from another, and such the case with funeral pies. Why do they have such a depressing name? Well, the pie was most often seen at funerals and was given to families as a consolation food. Most people agree that it got its name from how often they were seen at funerals. However, what we do know is that among the Amish community, these were not an omen of a deceased relative, but a sign of a delicious evening. Also, they continued the trend of spices and raisins being used in pies. Funeral pies eventually even made their way to southern USA cuisine, but today, even at a funeral, you would not find this. Spam and pineapple sandwiches, on the other hand, are a Hawaiian invention that makes some stomachs less audible. On the other hand, if you are anything like us, then maybe the blend of spices, fruits, and canned pork and ham will create a unique flavor trip for you. Spam and pineapple sandwiches in the state of Hawaii would usually be accompanied with things like mango slices or mango chutney, peppers, chili pastes, and fresh coleslaw. All of this really elevated the dish and gave it a strong identity to pull from when it was making impressions on people for the first time in the 70s, and most were good ones. While pineapples are eternally hated in America, this is one mix of different foods that a lot of citizens could get in line for, and that is why we are sad to see this one gone. So sweetbreads might sound like a dessert, but they're actually a type of offal from the thymus or pancreas of the pig. Traditionally, they were braised or sautéed, but some adventurous souls decided to barbecue them. While they're not for everyone, there's no denying their culinary potential. They have a notable place in Texas barbecue culture. In the Lone Star State, barbecued sweetbreads are considered a delicacy and often featured at high-end barbecue joints and gourmet barbecue competitions. They're typically paired with robust, tangy barbecue sauces and served alongside classic sides like coleslaw or pickles. They weren't the healthiest barbecue choice out there, but their taste made them irresistible. Next up, we have the shipwreck casserole. If you think this name's creative, keep watching, because some of these casserole names will leave you scratching your head. So, the shipwreck casserole was a go-to for families during tough economic times because it was simple, budget-friendly, and made with ingredients that were often already on hand. The name shipwreck referred to the hodgepodge of ingredients tossed together as if it were a shipwreck of a meal. Grandma's pantry was almost always stocked, but during the hard times, even she had to make do with whatever was available. This delicious casserole was versatile and typically consisted of ground beef, potatoes, onions, and canned tomatoes, with the occasional addition of baked beans or vegetables like carrots and green beans. Maryland's classic white potato pies are an incredible place to start off our listas. They are some of the most innovative, simple, and tastiest dishes to come out of the state. All you need for this are some ingredients you will probably have in your kitchen already. This includes mashed potatoes, a few eggs, butter, and a crisp pie filling that makes for a savory pie that lightens up any dinner. You might associate your pies with nothing but dairy and sweets, but people in the South would mix and match a lot of savory ingredients. Eventually, they found out that not only do jam and custard go in a pie crust, but mashed potatoes do too. Just a bit of vanilla frosting topped off a dish that broke away from convention and left everyone's stomachs happier for it. Comfort food peaked in the 90s for people in Maryland when everyone had this in the fridge, but it would vanish just a few decades later from most households. Bologna and cheese sandwiches were sandwiches that you could pull out of the refrigerator and have nobody raising any eyebrows, only happy smiles and eager stomachs. Bologna spreads were not too popular in America until the 70s when they first properly started picking up some steam. People got on the bandwagon once bologna and pepperoni pizzas started becoming regular takeout options in states like New York and Chicago. If it works on a pizza by the laws of nature, it must be tried on a sandwich or burger too. We are not sure who came up with that rule of thumb, but they were really onto something, because this made for a great sandwich that was a meal people ate when all there was for dinner was sleep. While a lot of those cheeses and spreads got discontinued now, we would love to try an authentic sandwich from the 70s because it sounds right up our alley. All right, let's talk about something a little more dignified: venison. Now, we're not talking about Bambi here, people. We're talking about grown-up deer meat. In hunting communities, barbecued venison was once a prized delicacy. Imagine the satisfaction of bagging a deer, bringing it home, and then turning it into a smoky masterpiece. It was not just a meal. Barbecued venison offered an experience. Venison's unique taste made it a standout choice for barbecue lovers looking to break away from the usual fare. It was typically marinated in a mixture of spices and herbs to complement its natural flavor. The best part? It is lean and packed with protein. Fitness freaks would have loved it if it was on the menu still. Calls for a comeback, don't you think? So, tamales are a labor of love, but thanks to Grandma, this tamale pie was a much easier way to enjoy the flavors. This casserole caught on like fire in the early 20th century, particularly in the Southwest, where Mexican influence was strong. Just like most casseroles on the list, this one-dish wonder was also a creation of the Depression era. Some versions of this pie started out as a way to use up leftovers, such as bits of meat, vegetables, and even leftover chili. But hey, no one complained because the end result was a delicious dinner. Many families have an heirloom recipe for this casserole passed down from generation to generation. So if this casserole brings back memories from your childhood, it might be time to give Grandma a call. She could be holding on to a secret recipe that she's finally ready to pass down to you. Be very wary of what you see on the internet when you search for a Jefferson Davis pie. For some reason, a lot of traditional recipes out there have started leaving out literally everything that makes this pie special. See, a proper Jefferson Davis pie is an antique 1970s recipe for sure. But even in the earliest 19th century references in cookbooks, it is dried fruit pie. Jefferson Davis made with spices, dates, pecans, and raisins, very each thick custard filling. In different parts of the South, the concentrated bourbon syrup to go along with it also got popular, but the pie worked as it was too. People were a little hesitant to try a pie with spices. But as far as vintage recipes go, both in the field, this pie left no boxes unchecked. We are quite sad to see it go, really. Sardine and mustard sandwiches are as basic as they sound and much better than you might initially give them credit for. Be realistic and think about a post-Depression era America where a lot of neighborhoods and homes were still reeling from the effects. Dollars could buy a bit more and went back to their usual strength, but everything was a bit touch and go for a while, and dishes like sardine and mustard sandwiches were the cure. Even more attractive than the taste was the price of this beauty, because for about $1.50 you had yourself a solid meal. Many labor workers, like your friendly neighborhood forklift or dock workers, might remember eating these during their lunch breaks. People would usually spice it up with other vegetables, toppings, and peppers to make a proper feast out of a cheap thrill. And we would like to join the fun too. The Southern loved making use of every part of the pig, and this next one was no exception. I'm talking about chitterlings or chitlins. These are the intestines of the pig. And while they might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of barbecue, they've been a beloved part of Southern barbecue culture for generations. Barbecued or smoked chitlins are prepared by thoroughly cleaning and cooking the intestines until they're tender and flavorful. The key to making chitlins enjoyable is all about seasoning and preparation, turning what might seem like an unusual ingredient into a delicious barbecue treat. Now, I'm not saying everyone will love them, but they definitely have a loyal following. But like many traditional foods, chitlins are falling out of favor. It's a sad day for those who appreciate the bold flavors of the South. You can't possibly reminisce about Grandma's forgotten casseroles without bringing up the ham and potato casserole. This one combined two classic comfort foods, ham and potatoes, and instantly became a favorite on the dining table. You know, all those leftover ham that goes bad in your refrigerator after the holidays? Well, this recipe was a way to spice it up and turn it into something new, and of course, Grandma did it best. There was even a healthier version of the ham and potato casserole that was made using lean ham, low-fat dairy products, and extra vegetables to boost the nutritional content. Grandma used whatever potatoes she could find at the farmer's market, but this one could be made by a variety. Some recipes called for russets, while others used Yukon Gold or red potatoes, depending on your texture preference. Green tomato pies might take your taste buds for a spin, since you might have rarely heard of or tried this pie. In reality, though, when made with summertime spices like cloves and cinnamon, they would take on a very fruity taste similar to apples or rhubarbs. In the 70s, green tomato pies were such a chic and in choice as far as your evening dessert plans went. Combined with their apple-like notes, they were called the apple pies of the summer in that decade. The 1970s had a whole spectrum of food, from experimentative train wrecks to simple knockouts. Green tomato pies were somewhere in the middle and did find a fan base, but not one strong enough to last into the new age of today. Okay, now that we've covered the respectable mutton, let's move on to something a bit more, shall we say, adventurous: smoked squirrel. In the early days of barbecue, this little critter made quite a splash at gatherings. If you think about it, the squirrel is kind of like nature's version of a barbecue snack: small, tasty, and with just the right amount of seasoning. The smoked squirrel was typically prepared by slow smoking the meat until it was infused with a rich, smoky flavor. It was a favorite among pioneers and early settlers who needed to make the most of their resources. While it might sound a bit unusual today, it's a great example of how barbecue traditions evolve based on what's available and what people enjoy. These days, you might not see a smoked squirrel on your local barbecue menu, but it's definitely a dish that deserves a place in barbecue history. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make, as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. Similar to funeral pies, transparent pies also had a tacky name with incredible flavors. The pie emerged in the 1800s around the northern Kentucky region, where people had very few ingredients for a pie due to financial constraints. Still, the cravings were there, and they needed to be filled, especially if you had kids in the households. So people invented the transparent pie, which used the most bare bones of ingredients like flour, eggs, and butter. Fast forward to the 70s, and the case was still very much the same. Summer vacation, hungry kids, and an empty pantry. So what is a 1970s stay-at-home wife baker to do? Simple. Go for a quick and easy transparent pie, which could not fail you. Even with the limited ingredients and whipped cream made this a proper treat. People today definitely could not make a pie out of such little ingredients though, so the pie vanished. Here's a dish that might surprise you: barbecued pork kidney. This unusual barbecue item was once a favorite among adventurous eaters who weren't afraid to explore every part of the pig. Pork kidneys, with their distinct flavor and texture, were often marinated and grilled to create a unique barbecue experience. Barbecuing pork kidney requires careful preparation and seasoning to balance its strong flavor. Pork kidney is a highly underrated cut of meat, but it is definitely an acquired taste. It used to be more common at barbecue gatherings, but it's become a rarity. It's still popular in some parts of the world. It's a popular dish in some Latin American cuisines, particularly in Argentina and Brazil, known as riñones a la parrilla. In Argentina, this dish is a nod to the country's love for offal and their grilling tradition. It's typically enjoyed with a side of chimichurri sauce. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy, scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma loved that. Chess pies are similar to both Osgood pies and Jefferson pies, but they leave out the meringue and creamy toppings for an even fundamental flavor profile. Simply put, chess pies are all about taking the basic ingredients that make a pie and nailing them completely. The most liberty this dish takes is some vanilla and tart lemon juice, which we mean, come on, we just talked about literal fried pies. A very do one thing but do it right type of pie. It was an incredible choice for gentlemen who love to go to parlors and pubs for a round of chess. As you can guess, that is also where it got its name, because they would order chess pies over a few rounds. Today, both chess pies and the game it gets its identity from are things that were much more popular in the 70s. Hot dog sandwiches are perhaps one track off of the 70s greatest hits album that we most want to see live with front row seats. In an era where they faced incredible competition, since hot dogs were already dominating street food, these ruled. You had everything that was in your typical hot dog, including the relish and the mustard mixed with sliced dogs. And honestly, this led to a lot more creativity. People only have so much space to work with in a typical hot dog. A sandwich, on the flip side, is a much better culinary canvas. Chefs could specialize with fried onions or different sauces, mixing and matching to their heart's content. No surprise that this got so popular back then, but it unfortunately could not last the long haul despite how much we desperately wish for them to pop back up. Now, squirrels aren't the only bushy-tailed animals on the list, because barbecued rabbits were the talk of the town in the early 20th century. In rural areas where game meat was more common than store-bought cuts, rabbit was a go-to option. Think of it as a tender, flavorful rabbit marinated in a tangy sauce and then grilled to perfection. It's like the barbecue equivalent of a Sunday roast, but with a bit more pizzazz. The barbecued rabbit was often seasoned with a blend of herbs and spices that set it apart from other barbecue options available. Rabbit barbecue wasn't as exotic as a squirrel, but it was still pretty uncommon. It was a staple in many rural barbecues. People would gather around the pit, sharing stories and swapping rabbit recipes. But as times changed, so did tastes. It's a shame, really. I mean, low fat, high protein, and finger-licking delicious. What's not to love? Remember when Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and canned tuna were the stars of the food aisle back in the day? Well, Grandma took those humble ingredients and spun them into her classic tuna noodle casserole. During the 1950s and 1960s, convenience foods were all the rage, and tuna noodle casserole fit the bill perfectly. It was a post-World War II creation and was whipped up in no time with ingredients already on hand. Plus, it was a classic comfort food that brought everyone together at Graham's dinner table. During the mid-20th century, tuna noodle casserole was a mainstay in American cookbooks and cooking magazines. It was often featured in advertisements and was promoted as a quick and easy dish for the busy homemaker. This one fell out of flavor, but thanks to the recent revival of noodle dishes, we might see this one back on the menus soon. In the meantime, why not dust off Grandma's old cookbooks and bring it back yourself? Hawaii has always brought a peculiar taste to any local dish, and chocolate hopia pie is no different. A chocolate pie with a coconut cream frosting topped with whipped cream, giving it a really pretty, milky white appearance. Taste-wise, you had strong waves of chocolate mixed in with perfect little kicks of coconut. Lots of rich whipped cream added the consistency the dish was otherwise missing, and it left the pie with few flaws to speak of. People definitely thought so back then, at least. You could find this in states literally the opposite side of Hawaii, like Ohio and Texas. In chocolate hapia pie, you had something that did not completely disregard standard American tastes, but added a refreshing little something to make it more exciting. Presently, even in Hawaii, this is a rarely made pie as it went out of style. Equally offensive to most conservative taste palates were pineapple and cheese sandwiches. As of 2024, it is a well-established fact that the West and pineapples have had a very troubled relationship. Pineapples try their best for America, and America acts like an alcoholic husband that cannot notice his wife, even on their anniversary. Back in the 70s, this was still a new culinary ground people were treading, just like ham and banana sandwiches. What they found was that it did not have the potential to go very mainstream, but it could grow itself a strong, loyal, and niche following. Most fans of this sandwich were in Hawaii, but in surrounding states, the trend took off moderately successfully. People loved the overly sweet and oddly comforting sensation of the sandwich, and we can see why. Pineapple and cheese sandwiches sound oddly delicious if you really think about it. All right, let's talk about a barbecue ingredient that's more often found in the pot than on the plate: smoked turkey necks. Now, these aren't exactly barbecue stars, but they do deserve a mention. Smoked turkey necks were once a popular ingredient in soups and stews, adding a rich, smoky depth to dishes that made them savory. The process of smoking turkey necks involved slow cooking them over a wood fire, which infused the meat with a smoky flavor while keeping it tender and juicy. Although they might not be the star of modern barbecue menus, smoked turkey necks still hold a special place in the hearts of those who appreciate their unique flavor and versatility. While the southern states were enjoying Tex-Mex cuisine, the northern states were all about Italian flavors, and baked ziti was a staple on the dinner table. Now, even with its Italian roots, you wouldn't typically find this one in Italy. This casserole was created by grandmas who were Italian immigrants to the States and adapted traditional pasta dishes to suit the ingredients available in their new country. Baked ziti was pretty much the long-lost cousin of lasagna, with the classic version including ziti pasta, marinara sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese. The ziti pasta used in the dish was tubular and smooth, which makes it ideal for holding onto the sauce and cheese. This one was a hit at Sunday dinners and had everyone coming back for seconds. Shoofly pie is a pie that first got its start in America's food history in Pennsylvania Dutch country as the go-to for when people had a crumb craving. Wanted a pie that had a crunchy crust and a crumb-filled topping? Shoofly pie was on speed dial and also on every bakery shelf in the 70s, just waiting to arrive at your doorstep. A molasses filling inside a sizable crust was the apple of every Pennsylvania resident's eye, and soon the infection would spread. People from every state started adopting their own versions of shoofly pies, although when the itch came for an authentic, flavorful shoofly, a road trip to Pennsylvania was in order. I guess when a dish boosts tourism for your state, you can officially consider it good. Those same folks now visit for other reasons since shoofly have flown away from bakeries. Ham and banana sandwiches are less digestible both literally and figuratively than most of the list, but they actually worked quite well. The trick was in how you sliced them, because if the banana slices were fat and thick while the ham was thin, you would have a really overly sweet sandwich. Meanwhile, if you did the opposite, then you would have a mushy sandwich that did not have any real flavor. If you did get the proportions right, and most people did after their first few tries, then you had a 70s DIY delicacy with simple ingredients. It made sense why most people did not know how to make a good one, because it was not common. People who lived in other decades hated fruit and meat mixes of savory dishes, but they had a lot more room to make an impression with the crowd in the 70s. Maybe people felt very tropical for a decade? The sandwich would be quite an interesting addition in menus today. Okay, we're back to pork, but in a whole new way: pork cracklins. These delicious morsels were made by frying the skin and fat of the pig until they were golden brown and crispy. In America, cracklins were often enjoyed as a snack or served as a topping for various dishes. Now, these haven't completely fallen off the radar, so if you still want to try them, I guess it's time to book a flight. In the Philippines, pork cracklins are known as chicharron, and they're a popular snack and ingredient in many traditional dishes. Chicharron is often enjoyed with a tangy vinegar dipping sauce or used to add crunch and flavor to stews and soups. Green bean casserole started out as a traditional Thanksgiving meal, but because of how much everyone loved it, it soon became a year-round delicacy. This one was also created as a creative way to market Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. When canned soups first hit the food aisle at grocery stores, many people were skeptical about them. Introducing new recipes was a way of encouraging people to add them to their daily meals, and Grandma really followed through with this one. The original recipe, known as the green bean bake, was developed by Dorcas Riley, a home economist at Campbell's. It combined green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and fried onions, and it was published in the company's recipe booklet. Our sweet old grandmas decided to make this one better by adding their own twists to the original recipe. Although traditionally rich and creamy, there were lighter versions of green bean casserole that used lower-fat ingredients or alternative toppings to make it healthier. Ever heard of a peanut butter and pickle sandwich? While both pickles and peanut butter are popular choices for bread-based goodness nowadays, there was once a time when people mixed the pickles into the peanut butter to make a sandwich. Around the 1970s, the peanut butter and pickle sandwiches really started taking off, particularly dill pickles. Something about the spice and tang of a pickle added a lot of character to a basic peanut butter sandwich. It helped that a sandwich loaded with vegetables was always more filling. On a budget or on an energetically challenged day where you cannot get yourself out of bed, this sandwich worked wonders for the masses. We definitely want this one back in lunchboxes and fridges in many states like the good old days. Before we leave the South, let's talk about fried pies, which sort of blur the line between a fried pocket and a pie. Pie crusts that were fried and filled with various fruit or cream fillings became incredibly trendy in the South. Actually, most things battered and deep-fried tend to come from the South, so there really is no surprise here. Your mind might be thinking this would not work and that the flavors are too different, but it actually clicked. Folks from outside those parts of the USA also would pick these turnover like pastries, enjoying the harmony of fruits and fried dough. Fried pies gave people a similar feeling to eating a chocolate donut, since sometimes they would be filled with chocolate. Currently, it is just a forgotten Southern legend. Sadly, since America moved on to healthier pies. No one does comfort food better than Americans, and the iconic potato chips and cheese sandwich is proof. People would grab cheddar or mozzarella cheese and a packet of Frito-Lays or a can of Pringles and get busy at the table but not in the kitchen. Reason being, this was one of those 10-minute dishes that took absolutely no effort or time to make, like instant noodles. Barbecue-flavored chips would be preferred, because they added a secondary flavor, but all kinds were used and the crunch was just to die for. In the 1970s, chips like Pringles were getting more and more popular in America, and that made it even easier for this to take center stage. What would follow in the decades after was a growing concern for health, and people stopped making their favorite potato chips and cheese sandwiches, but we would love a 70s plate. Let's talk about a meat that's making a comeback, but was once considered a novelty: buffalo. Back in the day, smoked buffalo was a rare treat. It was tough, gamey, and had a strong flavor that wasn't for everyone. But as people started to appreciate more adventurous flavors, buffalo made a comeback. While it's still not as popular as beef or pork, it's definitely gaining ground. It was a popular choice for those who wanted to try something a little different and show off their culinary prowess. They're still rare to find, but if you ever come across smoked buffalo on a menu, it's definitely worth giving it a try for a taste of barbecue history. Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day, because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know Graham used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before, so this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese?